ISRO wants to send humans into space. Aditya L1, India's solar mission, Chandrayaan-3, and Mangalyaan were just the start.
Sir, we have achieved soft landing on the moon. India is on the moon.
History has been created today.
But sending humans into space is obviously very different from sending satellites into space because it's putting human lives at risk. The stakes are huge. Only 3 countries in the world have human spaceflight capabilities: the United States, Russia, and China. And ISRO tried approaching them for help in the past, but that help never came.
We approached them for help in developing it, but the help is not that forthcoming.
And this just wasn't acceptable for India. And so instead of waiting around, India actually opened up its space sector to startups to accelerate its progress towards this goal of sending human beings up into space. And so now, for the first time in history, Indian startups can finally build and launch satellites and rockets into space commercially, something that only ISRO was able to do previously. And Indian startups and private companies have been assisting ISRO in their missions for years, like, for example, Omnipresent Robot Technologies that recently helped build the eyes for the Pragyan rover on the moon. But now Indian startups are taking things a step further, like, for example, Skyroot Aerospace. They recently launched Vikram S, India's first privately built rocket into space. And it's this direct approach by Indian startups that's going to be crucial in making India the next global space superpower. And so in today's video, Pankaj and I are going to be taking a look at the Indian startups that are making India's ambitious space dreams a reality in detail.
Yeah, and before we do that, I think it's really important to know about ISRO, its history, and how we got to where we are today. In 1961, the US President John F. Kennedy had announced to the world that they would reach the moon by the end of the decade.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Both the US and USSR were trying to one-up each other in the space race since 1957, when the USSR had launched the world's first satellite, Sputnik 1, in space.
And where was India during all of this?
India was just taking its baby steps during that time to create its own space program, and economically India was a very poor country at that time. India's GDP per capita was just $86 at that time, compared to US, which had a GDP per capita of $3,067, a number India is yet to achieve almost 60 years later.
Okay, so what I'm hearing here is that India wasn't in the most economically strong position at this time, so why would they look at space as something to be conquered when in reality, on the ground itself, on Earth, there were still a lot of issues for India to resolve?
The answer is a man named Vikram Sarabhai. And actually, he said that because India is a poor country, India should have its own space program. And let me pull out what he exactly said. There are some who question the relevance of space activities in a developing nation. To us, there is no ambiguity of purpose. We do not have the fantasy of competing with an economically advanced nation in the exploration of the moon or the planets or manned space flight. But we are convinced that if we are to play a meaningful role nationally and in the community of nations, we must be second to none in the application of advanced technologies to the real problems of man and society. So it was with these ideals that India's space program was launched in 1962. It was called INCOSPAR at that time.
INCOSPAR? Oh, I thought we were talking about ISRO here.
Yeah, so it was INCOSPAR that was later changed to ISRO in 1969.
Okay, well, I mean, this is crazy. 1962, INCOSPAR started. The very next year, they launch a rocket into space. I mean, that's, first of all, it's really incredible. Quite a turnaround from creating this organization to launching a rocket into space. And I think probably anyone that was looking at India and thinking, oh, this is just a poor country, they're never going to do anything here, they're never going to get anything into space, I think a lot of those people would have been surprised back then.
Yeah, so it was in November 1963 that India had launched its first sounding rocket in space. And it was launched from a small village called Thumba. And that's how India's space journey was sort of started.
Sorry, what's a sounding rocket?
So it's similar to a normal rocket. It's same powerful, but it doesn't escape Earth's velocity. It just goes up in the space and then falls down. And in order to achieve this, ISRO had to convince the US to send them their Nike Apache rocket, and even convince the USSR to send India the equipment it needed to set up their first sounding rocket station. Just imagine this for a second. India could convince 2 nations which were on the opposite side of a Cold War to help India in its own space mission. And that's how India's first rocket was built.
Wow, and this actually sounds like more of an achievement in a way, bringing these 2 countries together and letting them help India, more so than actually launching this sounding rocket, which admittedly was a huge accomplishment, especially in such a short time span. But it is just a sounding rocket. This is not a full-scale rocket. And I think at that time, it sounds like INCOSPAR really didn't have the capability to build rockets, full-scale rockets, proper rockets, and send them up into space, launch rockets, or even launch satellites, which I think are three things that are required to compete in this global space race.
Exactly. And if India had to achieve the vision that Vikram Sarabhai had laid, then India had to achieve all those three things that you just mentioned, right? But India was very poor country at that time, and developing space mission from scratch, it would take so much fortune and so much time. So what ISRO did, it relied on something called leapfrogging. And the idea was to get help from these countries who had built so many technology in the past and just focus on future technologies. And both these countries, USSR and USSR, they were ready to help India because India was a non-aligned nation at that time. And both these countries wanted India to be on their side. So that's how India got so many help. India got scientists, India got equipments, India got like tech. And that's how ISRO started its journey 60 years back.
And they probably didn't see India as much of a threat either. It's kind of like your little brother who's tinkering on spaceships and stuff. And you're like, okay, sure, give him some stuff, right? Whereas now, the rest of the world is actually looking at it and being like, oh, you guys are actually like in this race.
Exactly. And it was because of this help India got in early 1960s, that India was able to launch its first satellite in 1975, that was Aryabhatta, and build many rockets in that time. In 1967, Indian scientists built India's first indigenous sounding rocket, RH-75. Then in July 1980, India became the 6th country in the world to possess the capability to launch satellite into space, with the successful launch of our satellite launch vehicle, SLV-3.
And there's one thing here that I don't want to skim over that happened during this time period, which is the relocation of ISRO from Tumba to Bengaluru. And the reason why they did that is they wanted access to talented people, which were all here in Bengaluru thanks to ISC, and also a thriving industry that could supply them with the parts, the equipment, and the supplies necessary to actually build rockets. By the 1940s, thanks to Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, Bengaluru had become one of the biggest manufacturers of aircrafts in the entire country. And the city also had Bharat Electronics Limited, which was making electronics equipment for these aircraft, and aircraft technology was as close to space technology as ISRO was going to get access to at this time. And so that's exactly what they did. They moved to Bengaluru and gained access to all of this technology. They were able to collaborate with these manufacturers to help them build their satellites and their rockets, and it worked. I mean, it really paid off.
Exactly, it worked. And even in 1970s, at the time when ISRO was building these SLV rockets, they were taking help of 50 industries at least, right? And most of these weren't these government companies that you just mentioned, BEL and other companies. Most of these were private companies that were helping ISRO. And in this recent Mangalyaan mission, over 120 companies have contributed to its manufacturing process. And even the PSLV rockets that India builds right now, 80% of their production is outsourced to private companies. So ISRO has created an entire space industry around it by enlisting the help of private manufacturing companies that knew nothing about space technologies but are now leaders in the space. They've created an entire supply chain consisted of these private organizations, having more than 500 Indian companies in their ecosystem that have been heavily involved with helping ISRO in developing their rocket paths, satellites, and ground station facilities.
Yeah, ISRO's influence on the private companies around it is pretty incredible, and to the point where oftentimes there's these companies that have nothing to do with the space industry that ISRO will start interacting with, and then suddenly a space division will pop up within that company. So, I mean, HAL, BAL, these companies kind of fit already nicely into the space industry category, or they were sort of periphery, right? They were doing something similar, working in aeronautics, right? There's not a huge difference. But for example, Godrej was just making precision locks. And then ISRO contacted them in 1985 to help them make their high precision components for their rockets. And today, Godrej now has its own aerospace company that's making rocket engines for ISRO's PSLV and GSLV rockets. And that's just one example. Like you said, 500 companies have sort of had this influence of ISRO permeate through them. And I think that's just incredible. The amount of impact that ISRO has had on the ecosystem is just incredible.
Exactly. And if we take all of that into consideration, and if we come to today's time, today's India space economy is worth $8 billion. And that may sound too much to you, but on a global scale, that is just 2% of world space economy. So in 2020, global space economy was worth $447 billion, and it could reach $1 trillion by 2040. And one reason India's space economy is so small compared to world's economy, because there were so many restrictions that were put on India's space economy up until very recently.
Yeah, well, now this is really exciting to see that is actually changing. and the space is being opened up to private players in a way that it never was before.
Exactly. So in 2020, Indian government announced this decision that Indian space economy is now going to be liberalized. I mean, it's going to open up for these private players. They can take help of ISRO now. And to do that, they set up something called Inspace, which basically stands for Indian National Space Promotion and Authorization Center. And what Inspace is there essentially for, it's going to act as a bridge between the government and these private companies. And it's going to help these small companies to get the infrastructure that ISRO has built over the last 60, 70 years, right? And that's not all. They're also going to give them customers. They're also going to connect them with their customers, these global companies who want these facilities, so that they can have their business running.
Wow. So it's kind of like ISRO is almost acting like a space incubator in a way. They're helping these startups to succeed in a market that they're very familiar with. They have so many years of experience in this industry, but they know that a lot of these young startups probably don't. They don't have the connections that ISRO does. And so they're actually helping these smaller companies to succeed, which I think is just incredible. And I think a great example of this is actually Dhruva Space. So these guys have been around since 2012, but they couldn't really find any customers for their satellites. And it got so bad that by 2015, Dhruva's founder, Sanjay Nekanti, had actually started looking for companies to buy Dhruva. And so it was around that time that he decided to join his friends at Thibault, and they were actually making sensor-based products. And he realized that it was much easier to sell sensor-based products than to find customers for satellites, and that's actually how they managed to keep the lights on at Dhruva. And so basically what I'm trying to say here is that at that time, it was pretty much impossible to succeed in the space industry in India, and Dhruva found that out the hard way, but then Inspace came along. And by this point, Dhruva had already built their first two satellites, Thibault 1 and Thibault 2, which were the first two privately built satellites that were approved by Inspace. And so just for a little bit of context here, here's Dhruva's founder, Sanjay, talking about how instrumental Inspace was in helping them to launch these satellites.
We have gone to space less than 3 times in a year. And at every stage, Inspace was instrumental in solving some of the hurdles that we had faced, whether it is in terms of coordinating with different agencies to get permissions, or it could be in the form of getting access to test facilities, in certain cases also getting access to expertise from ISRO scientists.
So yeah, Inspace was a game changer, right? It came in 2020 and it sort of became a single window for these startups to tell their problems, tell their whatever demands to the government. And in next 3 years, many more such steps were taken. So for example, in 2021, these startup leaders, these industry leaders, they set up something called Indian Space Association. So it was sort of a group which was having, which will have its timely meetings, and then whatever they've decided, they'll just go and tell it to government. And then finally in 2023, Indian government launched India's space policy, which clearly set the rules and regulations, which sort of drive India's space sector now. And it sort of removes this ambiguity: what can you do, what you can't do, what's going to put you in jail, and what's legal. So that sort of brought a lot of clarity for Indian space startups today, and people are going to build tomorrow.
Yeah, and we can't really overstate just how important and beneficial this structure really is for the industry and all the startups that are in it. I mean, 2023 has been an incredible year for India's space tech industry as a whole. And I think the biggest thing to come out of this space policy, or arguably one of the biggest things, is the fact that now it's pretty clear that Indian companies can commercialize space-based services. And so Indian space companies basically, for the first time, since 2020, things have been evolving, but now it's clear, it's written, it's documented that there's a business model for Indian companies that doesn't require ISRO. They can actually do things on their own, and they can thrive and compete on the global space stage. So now we can finally move on to the part of the video where we talk about the startups that are innovating in this sector, the Indian companies, the private companies. Now, for the first time, we can say that the rest of the world is going to be looking at and noticing for the first time, because up until now, a lot of this space action that's been happening has been SpaceX and Blue Origin and these companies that are not based in India, that have nothing to do with India. People are looking at the United States for the most part and saying, oh, wow, all the innovation is happening there. Whereas now, for the first time, the rest of the world can look at India and say, oh, there's actually a lot of stuff happening there too. So let's talk about some of those developments.
Yeah, so you covered Dhruva Space earlier. Then there's another startup that we recently covered in our news video. It's called Galaxeye Space. And they're doing something very interesting. And I would say very ambitious thing. They're planning to build and launch world's first multi-sensor imaging satellite for Earth observation purposes. Today, for example, most satellites have a multispectral imager, which is basically a camera that takes images from the space. But this camera is ineffective when there are clouds in the sky or it's rainy. And with the help of Galaxeye, these images can be taken in every weather condition. So while Dhruva is helping its customers build and launch these satellites, Galaxeye is taking sort of a different approach. So they launch their own satellites and provide something called as data as a service. So their clients are these big companies which want data about oceans or forests and stuff like that, and they give them real time data about the Earth.
Yeah, and this actually reminds me a lot of Pixxel. So we did have Ois Ahmed on the show for a podcast where he talked about what he's building, and it's actually very similar. Data as a service, basically providing these images that Pixxel is taking with their satellites up in space, and they've built these satellites themselves. But they're not doing multispectral imaging. They're doing something called hyperspectral imaging, which is a little bit different. So far, they've already launched 3 satellites into space. And what's actually really interesting about these guys is they managed to get customers even before they had built their satellites. Today, though, they have 60 customers around the world who are relying on the data that Pixxel is providing to take key business decisions, including the United States government. So the US government is a customer of Pixxel's. And that's just the start. They actually want to put up around 24 to 30 satellites to create this constellation to cover the entire Earth and beam images as frequently as possible so their customers have access to timely, relevant data. And that's not where the ambition ends either. This is just the start for Pixxel. And in fact, while I was talking to Ois, he actually told me that he wants to get into asteroid mining, literally sending up mining vehicles to asteroids and basically breaking them apart and getting all the minerals out of them, and probably a lot of very valuable minerals and maybe even like diamonds and stuff, and then bringing that stuff back to Earth. Obviously very sci-fi, futuristic, but this is what Indian companies are capable of. This is what they're thinking about. And probably 10, 20 years down the road, this is going to be the reality because of this one decision that was made by the government of India to open up this sector and allow private players to build in this space.
So we've taken a look at the 2 of the biggest opportunities, I would say, for Indian space tech startups. One is satellite manufacturing, which is Dhruva is doing, and one is satellite communication, which is Pixxel and other startup that I mentioned are doing.
Basically satellite related services.
Exactly. And now I think the most important one is launching these satellites into the space, right? And next, those are the startups that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, and the one that comes to mind right away, the one that it's always on the top of everyone's mind, of course, is Skyroot Aerospace. So the biggest problem right now being faced by a lot of companies, a lot of space tech companies, is getting satellites into space in the first place. So launches are pretty expensive. They cost a lot of money, making it a very high barrier to entry for a startup. And oftentimes it can take months or even years before you can find a spot on a launch vehicle to get your satellite into space. So Skyroot Aerospace is trying to solve this problem by building a series of rockets that they're calling Vikram, the Vikram series, using 3D printing, which will not only cut the cost of building rockets by 50%, but also reduce the time to build them too. In fact, once built, these rockets can be assembled and launched within 24 hours. Now, they've already built and launched India's first privately built rocket, which was the Vikram S. So this was a huge success, of course, but it's also just the start. So there are 400 potential customers that have reached out to Skyroot Aerospace trying to book spots on their future rocket launches. Now, just to give you a bit of context on the cost involved here, SpaceX at the moment is the most affordable launch provider at around $5,000 per kilo being launched up into space. However, Skyroot Aerospace believes that they can bring that cost down to just $10. That's about 800 rupees for taking 1 kilo of payload into space. So this is wild, okay? That's more affordable to send 1 kilo of payload into space than it is to get an auto in Bengaluru. If you can get one, that is.
Yeah, and speaking of autos, the next startup on the list, they're building something called Uber for space. So the startup is Bellatrix Aerospace, and what they're building is something sort of a cab-like service. So what's happening right now is if you want to launch something in a, let's say, particular orbit of Earth, what you have to do is you have to wait for a vehicle, a big vehicle that's actually going in that particular orbit. But with Bellatrix Aerospace, they can just, launch for your single satellite, I would say, right? And for that, they've built something called OTVs. These are called orbital transfer vehicles. And in fact, now Skyroot has partnered with Bellatrix to use their OTV to help their customers launch multiple satellites into different orbits.
Yeah, so I think we've sort of covered a couple of different companies that are playing in this space right now. And I just want to highlight how incredible what they've accomplished is in a very short time span. 4 to 5 years is all it's really taken for these companies to become quite successful. Some of them are already generating massive revenues. There's N number of companies now that are building in this space, but they haven't yet launched whatever solution they've been building. And so I think in the next 4 to 5 years, we're going to see even more progress. But it just goes to show how much progress can actually happen once the space gets opened up, where we talked about Dhruva space having struggled because the space hadn't been privatized or opened up, liberalized by the government of India. And because of that, they just couldn't really succeed. Whereas now, as soon as the space has gotten opened up, suddenly we see all of the success happening and these companies are thriving, frankly.
Exactly. And most of these changes have happened in last 4 years, especially after 2020's decision of Indian government opening up the sector. So whether it's total number of Indian space startups or whether it's the funding they've raised, it's really gone over the roof, right? So before 2020, there were barely any Indian space tech startups, but now there are over 140 space tech startups in the country. And if you take a look at the funding these startups are raising, there has been a growth of 28 times in just last 3 years. So for example, in 2019, Indian space tech startups raised $3.7 million. And that number has grown to $112 million in 2022. So what we are seeing here is future is very bright for these space startups. And as Neil deGrasse Tyson very aptly put it here, that the first trillionaire in the world will come from space industry.
By the way, the first trillionaire is going to be the first person who exploits space resources on asteroids, on comets.
So by now, you guys should know what we're all about here at Backstage with Millionaires, right? We want Indian startups to succeed. And so looking at that Neil deGrasse Tyson quote, we want the next trillionaire to be an Indian space tech founder. And I think it's not far-fetched to imagine that that could be the case looking at the action that's already happening in this sector. I know that people look at Elon Musk, SpaceX, right? Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin. And yes, they do have a pretty good shot at becoming that trillionaire. But I think at least in the Indian ecosystem, the next Indian trillionaire is probably going to be a space entrepreneur, because Earth honestly is at this point overpopulated, overpolluted, overexploited. I mean, it's not a great place to dig up minerals and resources from the ground. And right now, mining these resources, these materials from space is prohibitively expensive, which is why no one is doing it. But of course, that price is going to keep coming down and down as the years go by. And at some point, the early movers in the space mining industry are going to make a killing from capitalizing on all of the resources that are out there to be collected and brought back to Earth for manufacturing. For example, asteroids are estimated to have 400 billion to 1.2 trillion liters of water inside of them, the ones that are accessible to us here from Earth. Then you also have this asteroid 16 Psyche, which is estimated to have precious metals and heavy metals worth $10,000 quadrillion. Like, I literally don't even know how big that number is, but it has 19 zeros. So this is like just that asteroid alone, that single asteroid. If somebody sent a mining vehicle to that asteroid, they could make billions, if not trillions of dollars. That's literally more than all of the economies on the Earth combined stored in this one single asteroid. So I can't overstate this. The people in countries that are able to learn how to mine asteroids in space and bring those resources back to Earth will have everything. They will have access to unlimited resources, water, and riches beyond what they can imagine. And the other thing too is that if you can mine things on asteroids in space, you might not even have to bring them back to Earth, right? You could actually use those resources to build colonies that are just floating out there in space. And again, if you have access to unlimited resources like water, which you can convert into other types of gases as well, or maybe there's asteroids that have other kinds of gases stored in them, then you can literally build these ecosystems, these floating ecosystems out in space, kind of like a space station, but probably bigger, like an entire country where people could just live inside of massive spaceships that were built out in space. I mean, at this point, if we start to think that far into the future, the opportunities are literally endless, limitless. And I think the people who are able to start building in this space now are the only ones who are going to be able to gain access to those opportunities later on down the road in a couple of decades when these possibilities actually become graspable. So this is Awais Ahmed's dream of mining asteroids in space, and Pixxel is a small stepping stone towards them actually building out that greater vision. But then also even Skyroot's co-founder, Pawan Kumar Chandana, wants to eventually build spaceships for the future for space exploration, not just for sending satellites into space, but actually exploring space with these vehicles. And then there's another Indian startup called Inspace, which is already working on building space cities, literally these colonies in space that I was talking about earlier. And it's very early days, of course. A lot of people are laughing at that company saying they're never going to be able to accomplish this, but I think that's just crab mentality. And I think, it's going to take time, obviously, and it's going to take a lot of money, and a lot of people, it's like a gold rush, right? A lot of people are going to fail. They're not going to get any of the gold, but I think, you have to start somewhere, right? And I think India is already on that journey, on that mission, and I'm super excited to see what happens in this space, in this country, in the next couple of years and decades.
Okay, so that's all from our side. And if you want to check Avish Ahmed's podcast, then the link is here.
Yeah, well, actually, we'll put it like somewhere right here. You guys can click on that if you want to check it out. I would highly recommend it, by the way. It's a great podcast. All right, that's it.
Thank you.